られない、でも諦めない、木箱拳に握りしめて、この運命と明日の記憶、きつく抱いて守るよ。
Kotaro swung his legs, hands on his knees as he tried not to fidget. This was definitely taking longer than he thought it should. He could just imagine Jiro doing all kinds of horrible things to him when they got back. The very thought made him tremble. After all, he'd let Mimiko talk him into going out without his older brother being present. Zelman blew out another bout of smoke, ignoring the disapproving looks of several nurses in the hospital waiting room.
And you're sure that's everything that happened?
He leaned casually back in his chair as the young vampire nodded.
Mother's going to be so mad at me. It's all my fault.
The redhead took another pull on his cigarette.
Hardly. Once things are properly explained, well, I'm more interested in that vampire you encountered anyway.
He stared ahead thinking. Something definitely wasn't adding up. Why would two different vampires go after the same compromiser? The dark-haired girl didn't have many enemies, at least not that he knew about. He paid little attention to Kotaro as he wiggled in his chair in obvious misery. He stood abruptly, making a decision.
I'll be right back.
He headed towards the exit. Kotaro watched him go with surprised eyes.
What's that all about?
Jiro woke to red silk and silence all around him. For a moment he allowed himself to just lie there, thinking. Then he realized that it was too quiet for a day when Mimiko did not work and Kotaro wasn't off playing. He thrust out of his coffin and immediately headed towards the kitchen. Out of the corner of his eye, he noted the time, a little past 4 o'clock.
Kotaro? Mimiko!
A piece of paper fluttered from the counter, Mimiko's scent of ginger and oranges coming from it. He quickly crossed over and picked it up.
Gone to the market, Kotaro's with me. Don't worry, we'll be back soon. Mimiko.
He crumbled the paper up, his eyes hard.
What was she thinking? Didn't I tell Kotaro not to let her go off without me being with them?
He smoothed the paper out again, rereading every word carefully. He wondered how long it had been since they'd left. Judging from how faint her scent was, at least an hour, probably more. A lot could happen in 1 hour. Anger burned through him. Couldn't Kotaro ever do as he was told? He pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to contain the anger, his other hand tight in a fist. And how could Mimiko go out and about as if nothing had happened when she'd woken in the middle of the night screaming, not to mention everything else that had happened? He regretted not telling her what Rinsuke had passed on. Maybe if he had, she wouldn't have gone off without him. He released his nose to stare thoughtfully into the room. Something was obviously bothering her. The nightmare, her small appetite the night before, being overly tired the past few days, they all pointed to that. But what was bothering her? And why was she being so stubborn about hiding it? He remembered the sound of abused metal being bent in the middle of the night, remembered warning off the culprit. Rinsuke's confession that someone was looking for the compromiser, someone who acted overly nervous about it. Even Janai was worried. Jiro's mouth twisted down into a rigid frown as he strode over to the door. He slid into his long coat, hat firmly placed on his head, and reached for his katana. He was going after them, and so help anyone who had done anything to her. He was just about to storm down the stairs when the main door opened and he could hear voices, along with a very peculiar double tapping noise that he didn't immediately recognize. It was almost metallic in sound and very out of place, but the voices were familiar, the younger voice chirping a bit anxiously at something the older female had said. He decided to wait. Kotaro appeared first, carrying some heavy bags, straining slightly under the load. He turned to look behind him, almost anxiously, Jiro thought. He found that he couldn't move as he also waited to see what Kotaro was looking at. His mouth opened in surprise as Mimiko entered on crutches. His initial instinct was to push down the stairs and take her up into his arms, demanding what had happened. But his movements were further arrested by the sound of another voice, a male voice. He gave a low growl. Zelman walked through the doorway, several bags in his hands as well.
Where would you like me to put these?
He put them on the ground when no one offered any direction.
Zelman!
Before he'd even thought about what he was doing, Jiro had drawn his sword and was charging down the stairs.
Oh no! Brother's gone crazy!
The young vampire jumped out of the way, dropping his bags in the process. Mimiko saw Jiro launch himself, murder in his eyes, and quickly planted herself right in his path, crutches firmly under her arms.
Jiro, don't!
She spread her arms wide to block him. The silver katana brushed past her face, cutting a few strands of her hair as it flared out with the sudden wind. The blade stopped with the hilt just past her right ear to point directly at Zelman's heart.
Get out of my way! I'll kill him! I'll kill him!
But Mimiko didn't move. arms still spread as she tried to balance on one leg.
Jiro, it's not what you think. Please stop this.
Zelman didn't so much as flinch, the blade less than an inch from his chest.
Quite a feisty girl you've got there, Silverblade. I think I'm beginning to like her.
Damn you, Zelman! What did you do to her?
He scowled over the compromiser's head, his eyes darker than pitch.
Brother.
Jiro waved him aside. He cowered at the expression given him.
Do? Absolutely nothing.
He pushed the tip of the blade away from him with one finger.
At least, not in the way you're thinking.
The katana began to shake in Jiro's hand.
You might want to put that away. It would really be a shame if you were to accidentally cut her.
One of Mimiko's crutches fell to the floor, distracting the enraged vampire, but she didn't dare reach down to retrieve it. She was the only thing standing between Jiro and Zelman, and she would not have Jiro kill someone when there was no justified reason for it.
Jiro, please.
Her face turned to the ground, not daring to look into his rage-filled eyes. Jiro checked himself. Seeing the expression on her face, his sword wavered, then fell away from her to land by his side, still exposed, but no longer threatening either her or the red-haired black-blood behind her. Kotaro clambered back from his hiding place, seeing some reason return to his brother's eyes.
It really wasn't Zelman's fault. Honest. Blame me. 'Cause I'm the one who didn't do what you told me to.
He cringed, bracing himself for the clobbering he knew was coming. Jiro sighed, his blade echoing the sound as it slid back into the sheath near his waist.
Kotaro...
If you want to get mad at someone, get mad at the vampire who waylaid us. Zelman helped us.
She took an involuntary step back at the sudden change of expression on Jiro's face, almost tripping over the fallen crutch. Zelman steadied her from behind, noting that Jiro still wasn't in a position to be reasonable.
Don't worry, I sent a few of my men to find him. I almost pity that vampire, though. Judging from what I've heard, he won't be getting too far at all.
Jiro tapped the hilt of his sword impatiently.
You might want to explain yourself.
Jiro's fangs clearly showed against his frown. At that moment, Zelman's cell phone rang. He looked down at his pocket in surprise, then pulled out the device.
Excuse me.
He raised a finger, then answered the call, totally ignoring Jiro's glare.
Sayuka.
He was silent for a full minute while Jiro ground his teeth.
I'll be right there.
He hung up and slid the phone into his pocket, turning to leave in the same movement.
Zelman!
Jiro took an angry step forward. The redhead waved absently.
Sorry, Silverblade. Compromiser. I have some pressing business to attend to. My apologies.
He strode out the door and was gone. Mimiko let her arms drop to her side, the left banging into her crutch with a slight ping as she let out her held breath. Jiro stared out the still open door, warring with himself. He really wanted to go after that bastard, tear him limb from limb. The red haze in his eyes only encouraged him to do just that. But everything was suddenly put back into focus as he heard Mimiko gasp. She was dangling a little precariously, clinging to one crutch as she reached for the other, desperately trying not to fall over in the process. Jiro sighed.
Allow me.
He helped her back up, reaching for the recalcitrant object as he did so. That act brought his face closer to her knee, and he stared in surprise at the sturdy brace now wrapped around it.
Mimiko!
The compromiser snatched the crutch from him and firmly put it under her arm, hobbling quickly towards the stairs.
I'm fine. Kotaro, get the groceries.
Jiro stood in shock for about 5 seconds, long enough for Kotaro to jump up and grab the closest bags to him, edging nervously around his brother. The tap-tap of the crutches woke him back to reality, and he turned to instantly walk by her side as she struggled up the stairs.
Mimiko...
Mimiko grunted with the effort of navigating upwards.
What? Jiro.
She stopped to rest, leaning ever so slightly against the railing to her left.
I'll never get used to using these ridiculous things.
He stared at the gentle curve of her shoulders, noting how they were hunched forward. Her hands clenched the rests between the two metal parts of each crutch. Elbows locked as she held herself up. He could feel the anger and frustration rolling off of her, though he wasn't entirely sure where it was directed.
Would you like me to carry you?
No, I can do it. I'm not an invalid, you know.
Jiro's lip quirked at the irony, and he had to resist the urge to laugh. What was it about her that caught him off guard and set him more at ease when he least wanted? He wasn't sure that he understood it. Mimiko's grunting brought him back from the thought as she struggled up a couple more stairs. She certainly was something, he decided. Not entirely all grit, but definitely stubborn and firmly set in her ways. And yet so completely innocent and vulnerable. Kotaro tried to sneak up past both of them, lugging another load of groceries with him. The stairs were just barely wide enough for him to scoot past the struggling compromiser. It wouldn't have been a problem if her crutch hadn't slipped on the stair in an attempt to not get his foot. Before Mimiko could even register that she was trying to place her weight on empty air, she found herself in Jiro's arms, back to his chest, crutches dangling from her hands. She let out a sound of surprise. Kotaro scurried up the last few steps.
Sorry.
He disappeared towards the kitchen, clearly intent on hiding from his brother, grocery bags banging behind him. Mimiko's heart skipped a few beats, and the grip on her supports lessened. They dropped from her fingers, sliding down the stairs with a lot of jarring clacks and bangs. The next second, she found herself swept up into the same position Zelman had used to carry her earlier that day. She was too surprised to say anything as he carried her up the remaining stairs, then gently set her on the couch, feet resting on the cushions as he slipped her shoes off. Taking one of several smaller cushions, Jiro used it to prop up Mimiko's right knee so that it wouldn't strain in the brace. He then placed the other small cushions behind her back. Sure that she was safe for the moment, he went to retrieve the crutches, leaving his katana, hat, and coat at the door. Jiro returned, setting the metal supports next to the sofa where she could easily reach them.
Thank you.
Pulling another chair closer to her, he sat down. He looked at her critically, comparing her current state to her usual one. The shadows were back under her eyes, he noticed, and she looked a little too pale. Then there was the brace, possibly little better than a cast. It looked like she'd had a very busy day. Mimiko watched the emotions scrolling across his face. He probably had a million questions he wanted to ask her, though she didn't know that she was in the mood to answer them. Sure, the day had started out all right, but like the last few before it, it had turned out to be a lot longer than she'd wanted. Jiro put his head in his hands, elbows on his knees.
Mimiko, what were you thinking? I asked Kotaro to make sure you didn't leave the house without me, and I wake up to find you coming home with Zelman Clock of all people, and injured! Why do you do this to me?
She blinked in surprise. Of all the questions he could have asked, that wasn't one she'd expected. She'd half expected him to go off about the vampire that had attacked her on the way home. Obviously, Zelman was first on his mind.
It's not like I went out to find trouble on purpose.
He looked up at her through his ebony bangs, his expression pained.
Mimiko, do you have any idea how worried I was?
His worry was evident on his face, his voice strained as he spoke. She blinked at him in surprise.
But I just went out for groceries. I even left you a note so that you wouldn't worry.
He took her right hand in his, caressing her palm with his gloved fingers, tracing the creases between her fingers. Inside, he was debating on whether or not he should tell her about the vampire who looked for her at work. It would be easier to express his concerns if he did. Absently, he turned her hand over, massaging the back portion below her wrist. He stopped abruptly, leaning in closer to look, his expression intent. Mimiko gave him a strange look, wondering what thoughts were going through his head. His mood kept changing on her, and she had no idea why.
Jiro?
He pulled her hand slightly closer to himself, then pointed at a discolored section on her wrist.
Mimiko, what is that?
The compromiser sat up to look for herself.
Another bruise, I guess. That's where that vampire grabbed me before we got away. I didn't notice it before.
Jiro gently put her hand back down, then looked intensely into her eyes. She was immediately entranced by the intensity of his gaze, not even sure what expression he now wore.
I need to know exactly what happened.
And, without realizing it, she was telling him everything that had happened since she'd gotten up that morning. Zelman leaned warily against the back of his favorite couch, one hand to his temple. This was all giving him such a headache, he decided.
Why can't all vampires be rationally chaotic like I am?
He held up the report Sayuka had brought him, once again impressed at her details and sleuthing skills. There was a lot of information missing that he definitely would have liked to have, but what she had managed to pull together in such a short amount of time was definitely worth applauding. A face peered up at him from the top sheet. Vampire, male, around his early 20s in appearance, closer to 16 in vampire years, still a baby as far as Zelman was concerned. But still such a force to be reckoned with, and accosting a compromiser in broad daylight. Granted, Mimiko hadn't been wearing her uniform, but it did seem that the vampire had known exactly who she was when questioned. Unless Sayuka had gotten something wrong, which was less than likely. It was a pity that the Coven boys had been so rough with him. He tapped his knee with an errant finger.
2 different people seeking out the same compromiser. Most interesting.
And he'd heard rumors of someone trying to break into the compromiser's apartment, another fragment of information Sayuka had extracted from a repair team sent to fix the damage.
But why Mimiko Katsuragi of all people? It doesn't make sense. Sayuka!
The woman who served as his personal assistant stepped out of the shadows.
Yes, Lord Zelman.
I need to know if there's any connection between these 3 incidents. Even the smallest piece of information or gossip will be helpful. I must know why she's being targeted.
Sayuka bowed, her glasses sliding slightly down her nose.
Of course, Lord Zalman.
She turned to go. Zelman leaned forward slightly from his perch.
And Sayuka, don't let the Silver Blade or anybody in the company find out you're looking.
He watched the light brown-haired woman incline her head before she opened the doors to the hall. He leaned back against the couch once more.
I just hope I'm not right about this.